As always, thank you for your presence this morning, and thank you most especially for your powerful example of faith, even on a very, very cold Monday morning. In the mid-'80s, 1986, a movie was produced and became very popular. The title of the movie was The Mission, and some of you may know of it. It starred Jeremy Irons, who played Father Gabriel, a Jesuit missionary sent to evangelize the indigenous people of northern Argentina, and a man by the name of Rodrigo Mendoza, played by Robert De Niro played him, who was a mercenary, a slave trader, one who murdered his brother in a fit of rage and jealousy because he thought he and his brother both loved the same person. Rodrigo Mendoza was a man who lived a very difficult, a very hard, a life that really caused others to pay for what he wanted to do, because he was a mercenary. And some very vivid scenes early in the movie show him as trying to enslave some of the indigenous people. And they show in the movie where he has this moment of rage where he murders his brother. And two unlikely persons came together at the beginning of the movie as Father Gabriel was beginning his ministry on his way to the upper lands, to the indigenous people. He was asked by the bishop to visit this man, Rodrigo Mendoza. This man, Rodrigo Mendoza, was imprisoned. He hated himself. He had no desire to be reconciled with God or within himself. He simply wanted to die. And Father Gabriel comes to him, and Father Gabriel tries to persuade him to seek God's healing and God's forgiveness, to be reconciled with his God and also within himself. And yet, Mendoza says he has to do some very serious penance for his sin. And so they come upon a plan. They take that which is his weapon, a sword, his armor, those things he used to enslave people and those things he used to murder his brother, which are very, very heavy burdens, symbolic of his sin and of his deep guilt. And he needs to accompany Father Gabriel into the internal part of the country to go and visit the indigenous people. This is an extremely heavy burden. It's an extremely dangerous and treacherous trip. It's very difficult on the body. And as you see Father Gabriel and Rodrigo Mendoza making their way, you see Mendoza, carrying this heavy armor, which wears him down, this heavy guilt, his sin, which he has to bear. And at one point, one of those who accompany Father Gabriel can't take watching this man suffer anymore. He runs, he gets a sword, he cuts the rope in which Mendoza is carrying his weaponry and his armor, and it slips down to the bottom of a great waterfall. And Mendoza turns around, he goes down to the bottom of the waterfall, he again gets the armor and the sword out of the water, and he ties it up to himself again, and he begins to carry his burden and his guilt. But at some point, Father Gabriel says to him, "You've done enough. God has forgiven you." And Mendoza lets go of the burden of guilt and sin that he is carrying. And what he does is he becomes a great support, a defender of the indigenous people with Father Gabriel, to the point of giving his life. Mendoza had committed a horrible sin. Mendoza needed to be forgiven. He did not want that forgiveness. Mendoza needed to be reconciled, restored to God, restored to his fellow man, restored within himself. Yet he carried this tremendous burden of guilt and of sin and of depression. But once he let that go, once he allowed himself to be reconciled to God, to his neighbor, and within himself, he began to live life anew. He cut the burden of sin, and he allowed himself to live again. Well, maybe you and I sometimes carry some of those very same burdens. Maybe not as heavy a weight as Mendoza, but each one of us at times carries the burden of guilt. Each one of us carries at times the burden of sin. Each one of us at times needs to be reconciled, either with God, with our brothers and our sisters, our neighbors, or within ourselves. We need to let go of the heavy burden of guilt, the heavy burden of sin. We need to be healed. Reconciliation really is that. It's healing and restoration. It's the healing of a relationship. It's the restoration and the making anew of a relationship, sometimes with our God, sometimes with others, our brothers and sisters, and sometimes within our own selves. And who of us at times doesn't need to cut away the burden of guilt, the burden of sin that tears away our relationship with God, maybe with our brothers and sisters, maybe a family member, maybe a friend, or maybe within our own selves, needing to be reconciled and restored. How often have we read the story of a brother or a sister who became angry with one another in a younger age and didn't speak to one another for years, needing to be reconciled, only to come to the point of death, not having been reconciled, and one or the other saying, "I feel so guilty and so hurt. I never spoke to my brother or my sister again." Or the opposite, a husband or a wife, a brother or a sister, a religious community member who needed to be healed, have his or her relationship healed with the other, and did so, went and either sought forgiveness and offered forgiveness, and how that tremendous burden was lifted and a person began to live with a greater sense of life and a greater sense of peace. Even in our own modern day, in some of the parts of the world where people were oppressed and beaten down by others, and at the end of that time when the situation had turned, they didn't seek violence. They sought restoration. They offered forgiveness, seek to be reconciled with their enemy. And what that brought about was a sense of peace, a sense of goodness in that land. Reconciliation, allowing our relationships to be healed with God, with one another, and within ourselves, leads to inner peace. It leads to a greater sense of life. It leads to a greater sense of joy. And each one of us is called to allow that to be a part of our lives. Today, we recognize Mary, the Virgin Mother, as the mother of reconciliation. And I think we do that because you and I know at times we need help. At times we need help to allow that burden of sin, the burden of guilt, to be lifted from our shoulders. At times we need help to lift that from another person by offering forgiveness. At times we need help by seeking to receive forgiveness. Mary, very much like any mother, and I can't speak for myself, but I can only speak from the number of people I know who are loving and caring mothers, the essence of motherhood is to give the gift of life, and to give that in such a loving way. You who are mothers and grandmothers, you know that much better than me. The essence of your life is that you gave the gift of life by bringing your children to term, and you continue to give it by caring for and loving them no matter what age. Well, Mary, our mother, the mother of reconciliation, is just the same way. Oftentimes, the essence of her goodness is the love that she shares for each one of us, a love that calls her to intercede for each one of us with her son Jesus. When Jesus was on the cross, he looked and considered his mother, he looked and considered the beloved disciple, and he said to Mary, "Woman, behold your son," recognizing that her maternal love was life-giving. But that maternal love was not just shared with that beloved disciple. At that moment, it was handed on to you and to me. The mother of reconciliation who can inspire us and intercede for us to seek to have our relationships with God and with one another healed and made better so that we can be healed and we can experience the gift of life, the gift of peace. There is a special Mass for Mary, the Mother of Reconciliation, and the preface of that Mass goes this way. In your infinite goodness, Father, all-powerful and ever-living God, you do not abandon those who stray from you, but in marvelous ways you call them back to your love. You gave the Blessed Virgin Mary, sinless as she was, a heart of compassion for sinners. Seeing her love as their mother, they turn to her with trust as they ask your forgiveness. Mary, our Mother of Reconciliation. And just like Father Gabriel, and just like Rodrigo Mendoza, each one of us is called at times to let go of that burden of guilt, to let go of sin, to renew our relationships with our God, with our neighbor, with our brothers and sisters, within ourselves, by seeking reconciliation. And there is great power in that, because in the gift and the power of reconciliation, there is the gift of new life. And so I'd like to simply offer to you two things to reflect upon during the course of this week, and please pray for me that I'll do the same. First of all, just take a moment to reflect upon the power of the gift of reconciliation. How life-giving it is to let go of burdens of guilt. How life-giving it is to let go of angers that we hold towards one another, to let go of those things that keep us from asking for forgiveness or offering forgiveness, to let go of our sins as we seek the new life of God through the sacrament of reconciliation, confession, and thereby restore our relationship with our God, our relationship with one another, our relationships within ourselves. Just take a moment to think about how life-giving that can be and how Mary, through her intercession, can help you and I to do that. But there's also a second side to this, which I would like you to reflect upon. It is this: we really need one another to be reconciled. We can also offer the gift of reconciliation one to another by encouraging a loved one who has not been to the sacrament of reconciliation or confession in a long time to go and seek God's healing and forgiveness, by encouraging a loved one to seek forgiveness from another or to offer the gift to another, maybe within our own selves, seeking that healing because of reconciliation. And as we seek and offer forgiveness, we also experience the gift and the power of God's life and God's love. As a matter of fact, you and I are essential to offering the gift of reconciliation one to another. And so, brothers and sisters, as we continue this season of Lent, and as we see Mary as our mother of reconciliation who can intercede for us, let us just take a moment to reflect upon the gift and the power of reconciliation, renewed relationships with God and with one another, and let us offer one another help in doing that. Thank you for listening.